So I wanted to do a quick follow-up video to the review that we did last week on these two cheap Damascus knives. Now I'll link that video below if you haven't seen it, and I wanted to address a couple questions and maybe some misconceptions that some people had on that video. Now first off, Yeo brown handle knife here did cut significantly more rope than the black handled knife did. I think it was something like 700 cuts versus 300. And that's exactly what we had. It was 300 cuts for the black handle knife and 700 rope cuts for the brown, even though during the cardboard test we had an equal number of cuts between both knives. So what's with the discrepancy in the edge retention testing? Well, I repeated the same test again using the black handled knife and got about the same 300 cuts. Now after looking at the apex up close, I've come to the conclusion that for whatever reason at the same geometry as the brown handled knife to cut 700 cuts, on the black handled knife we see apex damage along the apex after about 300 cuts, which is why the knife was dulling and not cutting paper. Now this dulling is due to a lack of apex toughness rather than abrasive type edge wear. Now it's almost impossible to pinpoint why this may be the case. It could be due to heat treatment, exact steel type, or apex overheating during the manufacturing process. So is this a big deal? No, it can easily be fixed by adding some geometry back to the apex. And so what we're going to do is we're going to increase the apex angle about 2 degrees. I resharpened the knife and added just 2 degrees of angle back to the apex in the hopes that it would help stabilize the edge. And against my better judgment, did the rope test again. And what do you know? At 300 cuts, it's still slicing paper. And looking at the edge up close reveals a much more intact apex. I think that these two knives are about equal in terms of their actual real-world edge retention. I really didn't see a huge leap in performance between either of these two knives anywhere other than the rope test, which a very small geometry change seemed to fix. I think that this should show the power of geometry and why edge retention testing should often be taken with a grain of salt, since sometimes very small differences can sometimes mean huge changes in the results. I know a lot of this sounds ridiculous, but that's kind of the reason that I didn't include it in the original video. It would take a lot more experimentation in order to really narrow down the exact causes of the discrepancy in the rope test, and I don't really think that for everyday use it's necessary, and otherwise these two knives are pretty much identical in terms of their real-world performance when it comes to edge retention. Now one more thing that I wanted to point out was the layered or sanmai construction, specifically as it relates to the strength break test that we did. Now, a lot of people are under the assumption that this Damascus pattern or sanmai construction has no other purpose other than looks. Now, I personally think that it does look cool. I like the way that it looks, but in this case, it also has performance benefits that I didn't really point out in the original video. Now, the fact that we have these two sort of outer, softer layers sandwiching the hardened inner core steel does give this knife a little bit more strength when it comes to like breaking it in a vise, for instance, or resistance to breaking in any way. The two softer outer cores absolutely help stabilize the much harder inner core to keep it from breaking much sooner than it otherwise would. Now, I wish I did, but I don't have a non-sanmai version of this knife made with just the inner core steel. I would bet a lot of money that the sanmai version that we have here will bend much farther before breaking than a uniform piece of inner core steel would. So it absolutely is helping in that regard. Now, does this actually translate to real life performance or usage? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. However, in the meantime, it does look nice and is providing some strength benefit. So there. Now lastly, I do plan on testing a lot more of these knives. These things are all over the place on Amazon, and I'd really like to get my hands on a lot of the different brands, maybe styles, to see if this sort of quality or thought process behind a lot of these knives ends up being the same. If it is, that'd be a fantastic thing to find out. These knives are surprisingly good for their price. Are they custom knife good? No. Like this one from my friend Josh over at Edge Knife Works. definitely go check him out. Another thing that I cut out of the original video was I tested a custom from Josh, and it cut about 5 more cuts on the cardboard test before it stopped really shaving, which may not seem like a lot, but it is as a percentage, and that is a conservative measurement, not to mention all of the other things that go along with a custom like thinner edge geometry, hollow ground versus flat ground, sourceable labor and materials, and so on. But they are absolutely worlds apart from your average big box store knife. And when it comes to price, I think a lot of people had said that that $50 to $70 isn't a cheap knife. And the thing is that cheap is kind of relative. Cheap doesn't mean anything unless you provide context. So sure, you could buy a $14 cheap big box store knife with laser etched Damascus and 20 to 30 thousandths behind the edge. It's not gonna hold an edge well, and it just doesn't cut very well due to the extremely poor geometry. So one thing that I've noticed right off the bat from switching between these two knives, this is really thin geometry versus really thick geometry, is that in this knife's dull state, it still cuts better than this knife does when it's sharp. There's just way less resistance pushing through this rope, simply due to the thinness of the blade on that thinner Damascus knife. Anyway, these are just a couple of things that I wanted to point out in this follow-up video. I usually do these after sort of a big review like this. And if you have any other questions, leave them in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.